This is something that I've been doing that like I said, I'm not that interested in, but I think I have subs that are in the UK, which is the reason I did it, and how it kind of affects the EU and tangentially the United States. So I got some kickback from some Brexiters that are in the UK that how they found me. I have no idea. They tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about, even though when Brexit first happened, when I first heard about it, when the vote was going down, I knew it was going to pass. And then after that, I knew who was behind it. The Crown is behind it. And I've documented other things that tell you that the Crown was behind the Brexit. Now, said things that aren't particularly published as reasons why I think that they did it, but I'm not going to go into that here. But I'm going to read this article, Behind the Brexit Chaos, a Faulty UK Negotiating Strategy. And I'm not going to read the whole article, but I'm going to read bits and pieces of it. You can read it for yourself because it's kind of long. But it pretty much sums up a lot of what I thought was going to happen in the very beginning, even though a lot of people aren't tying Brexit to what's going on in France and also Syria and Libya. It's not being tied there. And the flow of immigrants that was actually caused by Syria. The war in Syria, which the UK and France had a huge hand in starting, continuing, and being involved. And when the refugees have to come to not the UK, but to the European Union to get away from the violence, then all of a sudden the UK wants to close up their borders because of the flow of immigrants. Well, anyway, that's beside the point. When British politicians launched Brexit negotiations after the country's 2016 referendum decision to leave the European Union, they were confident they could win a special deal by finding allies among the 27 remaining members of the bloc. In other words, they thought they were special and they could get as good a deal outside the bloc as they could inside the bloc. Skipping down, if London sought to divide and rule in Europe, an echo of its historic balance of power strategy in continental affairs, it has been met with a unity that has surprised both sides. Diplomats and officials from the UK and EU believe Ms. May's government made important tactical mistakes in the talks, but they say that the root of British miscalculation was the failure to understand that a country leaving the bloc would be treated by its 27 counterparts fundamentally unlike one, even an awkward customer like Britain that was inside. In other words, you're not going to get the same deal outside the bloc that you did inside the bloc, which Great Britain thought they could negotiate because of their position the same way they historically had. We are stuck in the mind state that we ought to be treated as a member state, said Ivan Rogers, the former British ambassador to the EU, who resigned over differences with Ms. May's government in January 2017. A partner inside the bloc, he says, naturally becomes a rival and competitor outside of it. That should be obvious. Skipping down, he said the EU's negotiating stance derived three central principles from the bloc's negotiations with Switzerland more than 30 years ago. The EU will prioritize its own integration over the interests of any non-EU third country. It wouldn't allow third countries to decide what was permitted to happen inside the EU, and the rights of access to the EU's market and institutions will be balanced by its obligations. Under the third principle, Mrs. May's insistence that the UK would stop freedom of movement of labor after Brexit meant it couldn't at the same time be inside the EU single market as non-EU Norway is. In other words, Norway was willing to take on some of the obligations even though it's not part of the EU, it will take on EU's obligations and their rules to be inside the single market. Great Britain didn't want the obligations, but they want the rights that are inside the single market, which is very British. London embarked on the talks with a more transactional approach. It expected to appeal over the heads of Brussels-based negotiators to the industrial interests in other countries, particularly Germany. British politicians expected that German manufacturing industry's desperation for continued unimpeded access to the British market would push Chancellor Angela Merkel into giving Britain special access to the bloc's single market. Britain wants a single market without the obligations. Instead, Ms. Merkel and other EU leaders prioritized the balance of rights and obligations in that single market, calculating that giving the UK privileged access will provide incentives for other countries to seek the same deal. Why be inside the EU if you're going to get the same goodies? Why buy the cow if you can get the milk for free? Does that make sense? Is this making sense to you? Now, if you're the United States, and you got the big hammer, you can cut that deal. The UK is not big enough. In fact, from the very start, the EU saw itself as holding whip hand in the talks, convinced that a failure, while bad for both sides, would be worse for the Brits. Their reasoning was based on a huge economic imbalance. While 45% of British exports go to the EU, only two EU countries, Ireland and Cyprus, send more than 10% of their exports to the UK. The UK also anticipated it could appeal to traditional allies in Northern Europe like Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Inside the EU, they had together championed the values of free markets and open trade. But once the UK left, a different dynamic took over. One issue the UK missed was that some of these governments were also faced with Euroscepticism and political concerns about EU overreach. In the turmoil immediately after the 2016 Brexit referendum, Mark Rutte, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, said one of the most like-minded countries said that the UK had just collapsed politically, monetarily, constitutionally, and economically. Mark Rutte, facing the political fight of his life against the right-wing populism of Geert Wilders, had a fundamental political interest in ensuring that Brexit turned out to be the anti-model for how to handle angst about Brussels. The Dutch leader echoed that point Thursday. If anyone in the Netherlands thinks Brexit is a good idea, look at England and see the huge damage it's done, he said. The UK also missed that it would come to be seen as rival. Some Northern European countries have many cutting-edge small exporters who worried that an UK outside the EU would undercut them in international markets and in the EU if Britain retained easy access to the bloc's market. London also thought it could rely on the states of Eastern Europe, those whose EU membership the UK had championed. Now, see, you championed those Eastern Europeans, and those same Eastern Europeans came to your shores to work. Now, the people that you brought in, you don't want to be responsible for. But some of them, deeply embedded in Germany's manufacturing supply chains, had a lot at stake in defending the single market. Many of those governments were also conflicted as hundreds of thousands of their most enterprising young citizens had left home to flock to opportunities in Britain. If some of them returned, Brexit might, for these countries, have a silver lining. This is from the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to rant for a second. So you detractors, you limeys that are calling me an asshole, don't know what I'm talking about. This is something I said 2 years ago. They were not going to let you off lightly. They were not going to give you a sweetheart deal. You can't be active in the EU, propose a lot of changes, champion people getting in, and then all of a sudden decide you're going to walk out because you don't like something. And you got 500 other countries that are willing to walk out. So if you get a sweetheart deal, everybody else gets a sweetheart deal. Then there's no use in having an EU. So those people that want to hold the EU together are going to make you an example. So you thought that because you were the UK, you were Great Britain that once ruled the world, that was going to mean something in 2018. Just like the last article I read about the Brexit that was coming out of the Financial Times, which is in London. Who you were is not who you are. Who you were is not who you are. And just because you have British pride, you don't think everybody else in their country have it either? That they're going to let you walk over them because you're Great Britain? 1914, Germany didn't think so. 1939, Germany didn't think so either. So in 2018, guess what? You're just another country. An important one in the EU, but still just another country. And outside of it, you're a rival. And they're going to punish you. Just like this article says, they're going to punish you. They're going to make an example out of you. You should know that, which is something I said 2 years ago. So all the stuff that they sold you, all the stuff that they told you that Brexit was going to be easy and basically you're an indispensable part of the EU. Maybe you are, but the EU is willing to take an L to make an example out of you, which I'm sure your leaders actually knew that. That's how come they're trying to bribe their Commonwealth partners to come back. You do not have the land and resources to swing with the bigger countries in the world. You just don't. And the tech advantage that you did have doesn't exist anymore. It just doesn't. Great Britain is not on the upswing that it was 200 years ago. Great Britain hasn't been on the upswing for the last 100 years. So don't come to my channel with that bullshit that you guys are talking. I can read just like you can. I can look at world events just like you can. And some things are very obvious. This is very obvious. Your leaders have not tried such a risky gamble if they thought that the EU was going to hold itself together and be viable. Evidently, they don't believe that. Now, whether that's true or not, we'll see. But evidently, they didn't believe it. So they thought it's better to be outside of it than inside of it. And they thought they could get special privileges because of their economy and their banking sector. Evidently not. Because the EU has not budged not one iota. Not one. Even though Theresa May tried to go sweeten the deal, they tell them the deal is a deal. The price is the price. Deal with it. In fact, you took 2 years. They told you file for it right now so we can get you out of here because you're not going to get a better deal. And talking didn't work. Talking for 2 years did not work. It's obvious. But anyway, I got one more article to read from this one. About this one. Normally I wouldn't, but I've gotten too many of you knuckleheads from the UK dropping dumbass comments in my comment section. So I am going to dig in. I should do a whole week of this shit just to grate your nerves. But anyway, I'm going to jump off here for this one. This is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.